Hello and welcome to Series 3 of The Greatest Good, a UCL Press podcast. I'm your host, Professor Philip Schofield and Director of the Bentham Project here at UCL. Jeremy Bentham, the 18th and 19th century philosopher, was the intellectual inspiration for the founding of University College London. In this series, we focus on the intersection of Bentham's ideas with current thinking on climate justice, in conversation with leading UCL academics.
And most extinction now is being driven by human overconsumption, by a very small proportion of people on this planet. It's only a small proportion of people who've ever lived, and we have to start living on this planet as if we intend to stay here. Okay, so my name is Jon Bridle. I'm Professor of Evolutionary Biology here at UCL, and I'm also the Director of the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research. My own research really is mostly focused on understanding maximum rates of evolution in response to environmental change, to understand how quickly populations and organisms or populations will be able to evolve to cope with the huge challenges that are being put onto the communities that they're part of as a result of climate change and biodiversity loss. So human activities largely. And that's very pertinent at the moment because we think that environmental regimes are now changing beyond the point that most organisms would have experienced them during their last 1,000 years of history. So the average now is more like the extremes they would have been prepared for. And as those averages move beyond, so the extremes around those averages become actually unusually and totally different to what they've ever experienced. And what's interesting there is they might start to behave, or they often start to behave in ways that are totally nonsensical. There's all kinds of interesting examples where organisms have responded to anthropogenic pressure. One of the most celebrated examples is overfishing of cod. It has the life history of something that should actually be very common, but because it's so overfished, it's actually become more and more hard to find. And the evolution that happened to the populations of that species was that they developed much more quickly, and they actually ended up becoming much harder to find. So they stay closer to the bottom of the ocean, and their adult size is much smaller because they have to develop more quickly. So they've adopted a sort of faster life history, which actually makes them less profitable to fish. So examples like that are kind of evolutionary examples where populations have adapted, have evolved in response to pressure, often in ways that one can't predict. Nature is continually surprising us by how it, what it reveals to us as we study it. This is more something that happens within the lifetime of a genotype of an individual. And different genotypes vary in how flexible they are throughout their lifetime. So the idea of learning in some vertebrates and in many animals is the idea that you're constantly able to acquire new skills in response to the environmental need. But also that form of flexibility is a double-edged sword because it can also mean that other organisms can change your behaviour for their benefit. So if you're infected by a fungus or infected by something, or if you're manipulated by your peers, you can do behaviour that's actively destructive to your own welfare or to the welfare of your family. So this is a whole different issue here where we're talking about maybe the idea that, societies of some human societies and some other primate societies function around social manipulation and driving individuals to do acts which are actually against their own interest or the interest of society.
So in a sense, is that what the human race is doing at the moment to the planet?
Well, that's very interesting. So there's a system in place where society is organised around the benefit of a few individuals and maintaining the privilege of those individuals at the expense of the planet, and actually at the expense of the well-being of most people on this planet and most people who are going to be born in the future, as well as all the other biodiversity on the planet. And that's the really fascinating thing, that system to basically transfer wealth from the poor to the wealthy continually is becoming more and more efficient and more finely honed, and arguably a way of buffering the consequences of our destruction of nature from us initially, even though our children and our grandchildren will be directly affected by the loss of the ecosystems that we depend on. So it's really fascinating how that's happened, and you could argue that the presence of the evolution of a brain which allows you to be constantly reprogrammed and affected by your immediate environment and the reputation you have among your peers is actually a form of cognition that can lead to a lot of self-delusion. There's a lot of argument about the idea that we're encouraged to consume things that make us less happy, consume things that make us less healthy, spend our time in ways which are destructive to our family life and our own lives. You know, there's the famous quote that we're borrowing money we can't afford to buy things we don't need, to impress people we don't care about.
Yeah.
And the irony of that is that consumption is destroying the planet. It's destroying the ecosystems that we depend on, as well as destroying the option and the futures of our own children and most of the people on this planet now. And that's an incredible tragedy. And the added tragedy to it is we're paying taxes to make that happen. It's not something that happens naturally. It's not a natural economic system that would make that happen. It's because those types of activity are heavily subsidised by taxpayers. So public money is being used to make the destruction of nature profitable for a few individuals now.
See, that would make perfect sense to Bentham.
Yes.
Because I mean, on the one hand, he would say, you look at the structures that people are placed in, and it's not that these oligarchs, let's say, or even people in Europe or in America are necessarily bad people, but they're just pursuing their interest. And if we were in the position of an oligarch or Bill Gates, we'd probably do exactly the same.
Well, Bill Gates is an interesting example, but I think I think that's quite a pessimistic view, because I think there's a continual need for society to negate those things, or for capitalist society to negate those things that really makes people happy, which is the love and respect of their peers, their family, and the feeling of contributing to a community that values them. Mm. If you think about left-wing and right-wing politics, I mean, one could argue that that's a question about how wide you put your net of people whom you care about. If it's just your family, I don't think there's any political system that says you shouldn't love your family. There's lots of reasons, like from a biological point of view, why loving your children is a very important thing that's evolved, right? But it's the ability to reimagine and to love those people who are different and who you don't have a direct connection from, which is one of the things that we as evolutionary biologists really try to understand. And that brings us on to another sort of aspect of what UCL is famous for from a biological point of view, which is understanding the rules, trying to understand the rules that govern what makes forms of life cooperate with each other rather than come into conflict, and what's caused the evolution of complex organisms from single-celled organisms. So this big leap from a single-celled organisms that are sometimes form colonies but are mostly independent, to multicellular organisms, essentially societies of cells, which choose to devote themselves to the reproduction of the whole organism, the superorganism, if you like.
Can I?
So I know I'm going all over the place.
No, it's all right. I want to just backtrack a bit and ask you about evolution, and particularly the term, because, as Bentham tells us, words are important.
Yeah.
And the associations of the word evolution are usually quite positive, in that evolution means things are adapting better to the circumstances in which they live. But the way you've been talking about evolution is that it's sort of crisis management.
And I mean, that's how maybe we couch it, as kind of organisms have got to respond. It's like a reaction, a sort of emergency response. But evolution is much more fundamental than that. I mean, it's everywhere. And I think people probably not really conceiving of evolution in that sufficiently broad sense are kind of losing that message. So that people typically think of evolution as survival of the fittest, which is a very, very narrow and shallow way of thinking about evolution. What's attracted me to study evolution is the fact that evolution is quite contingent on what's available, what types of variation are available in that moment for natural selection to work with. And all it's doing is basically maximising the transmission of information from one generation to the next. And it favours genotypes, or it favours alleles or bits of genotypes which are able to do that more effectively in that particular environment. So it's not necessarily universally better or universally more fit. It's just a system where organisms will evolve, or genotypes or genomes will evolve to be more effective at transmitting their information. And they'll get as complex as they need to be, if you like, but complexity has a cost. So in many circumstances, they might evolve to become less complex.
So we should think of evolution more as a descriptive rather than a normative term.
This is the thing. People imagine this kind of ascendancy and this ladder of life, but I think it's absolutely the case that, evolution is important because it's creativity. There are new ways of living that are imagined through evolution, that become apparent through evolution. And the history of life has long periods of diversification. You go from the origin of life to increasingly diverse forms and the proliferation of life into many different forms.
And we're losing that.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So well, we're simplifying a lot of communities because selection is very broadly being shaped increasingly by human activities. So those human activities impose certain types of selection that are quite consistent and quite strong. I mean, for example, applying pesticides to populations of insects, say mosquitoes, that will drive them to evolve in a particular way at all costs, because the most important thing there is they have to survive the pesticide. And normally what happens when you select on one particular thing is you cause other things to become less good. And this is really interesting and fundamental, is this idea of trade-offs. The idea if you do one thing well, you can't do something else well, because you only have so many genes that do things in your genome. You only have a limited amount of life, a lifespan that you can develop an organism, a phenotype in. So we know that when you select for pesticide resistance, if you compete those individuals in an environment with organisms that are not pesticide resistant, but without the pesticide, they won't do very well. Because typically they have lower metabolism to cope with the pesticide. They might have lower fecundity, so lay fewer eggs. They might well be less good at evading predators or parasitoids or infection. So everything that happens in evolution has a cost. And that idea that genomes evolve for particular sets of circumstances is fundamentally what creates the diversity of life. If there was no cost to doing one thing and not another, then you just have one or two species that do everything that are quite simple. But actually the challenge for evolutionary biologists is to understand why life has proliferated into so many different places. When the joy of being a biologist is you go to anywhere in the world, any community where there's life and there's lots of diversity. And there's not just one species that's very plastic, it will be different species that fill different niches and they have different jobs. And it's, that kind of, we see that within the organism as well, right? We see that in terms of organ systems and the specialization of a body into different forms.
So is this sort of a warning about unintended consequences? Because there are things which we regard as nasty, at least nasty to humans and perhaps to other species, but by annihilating them, that may cause all sorts of other problems for other species which are regarded as beneficial.
Well, definitely. We potentially have the technology now to eliminate malarial mosquitoes from populations by certain types of engineering techniques. The question is, what are the consequences of eliminating mosquitoes? Do they have other roles in communities that would actually cause other things to become much more common? I mean, one of the things about communities is if one thing becomes very abundant, something else will increase in number to reduce the abundance of those things. So, nature abhors a vacuum, so they're constantly finding new ways of living, and it's beautifully creative, and that creativity comes out of natural selection. The difficulty is when you start to see natural selection as a good thing or as a bad thing, as you say. Every time I have a tutorial group, almost always there'll be one student who says, well, surely extinction's natural because one species is just becoming dominant at the expense of another. But making that case for ethics out of naturalness is a very dangerous, because then I'll say, well, I assume you can justify murder in the same way or genocide. Anything that's natural isn't necessarily good, right? This is pretty fundamental. And there'll also be people who are saying, well, surely humans are no longer evolving because we have hospitals. And you think, well, that's a really limited way of imagining what evolution is. That you're some forms of early mortality you're preventing, but you're preventing those forms of early mortality only for quite privileged societies on the planet. I mean, most of America doesn't have access to healthcare, right? So many societies fail to provide even basic healthcare for their citizens. And also you're ignoring the fact that what is really driving evolution is differences in reproduction rate. It's not when you die at 70 or at 90 or at 50. It's actually what's happening in terms of the rate of proliferation of the spread of different genes at different points.
Is that because you only have to live to a certain age to reproduce?
Yeah, so then you're drawing me into talking about age, the evolution of aging, which is something else that was pioneered at UCL,
Right.
which takes us back to this idea of thinking about the organism as a society of cells, the multicellular organism as a society of cells, who have chosen or have evolved to cooperate to maintain an organism for X number of years. But the main role of that organism is it's a vehicle for genes to be transmitted to the next generation through your sex cells. Sex is a very hard thing to understand as from an evolutionary point of view, because it's not necessary for reproduction. So what's happening with sex is that a genome is only transmitting half of its genes to the next generation. And that's the female genome is transmitting only 50% of its genome to the rest of the generation, when it could be transmitting 100% by reproducing without sex, which is what most cells do most of the time when they undergo mitosis. So what a female genome is essentially doing is allowing the evolution of males, the male sex, to come in and basically parasitize them. An unrelated genome, then 50% of that fuses with your own genome. And so each one of your genes has only got a 50% chance of being transmitted instead of a 100% chance of being transmitted. And we call that the twofold cost of sex. So sex has to be sufficiently advantageous to basically to exist in the abundance it does. It's almost all eukaryotes have sex. It has to be sufficiently advantageous to be twice as good to have a genome that's a mix of two different genomes than one that's just a reproduction of the mother. So when you see a pregnant placental mammal, around here there's lots of females and some of them are pregnant, you can look at them as hemiparasites. They've essentially been parasitized by a male, and they're carrying around a huge cost to themselves, physiologically, psychologically, and in terms of their fitness, they're carrying around this baby that 50% of them is totally alien to them. And actually placental mammal evolution involves inheriting genes from viruses that stop an immune reaction against that thing that you're only 50% related to. So the best explanation for that goes back right to the beginning of the interview. The best explanation that we have is that ultimately it increases the variation. So in a situation where the environment is constantly changing, it's not good to be just like your parents, just like your mum. You have to acquire new genes which can allow you, that population will be able to respond to new challenges. Yeah. And that distinction between the somatic line, the maintenance of the organism, and the transmission of information it was first thought of by August Weismann, a German scientist, but was really recognised as important by Lancaster, who was one of the first zoology professors at UCL.
Oh, when was that?
Oh, they would have been 1870s, I think.
Right.
So Grant was the first person to teach evolution, at least in England, to teach evolution by natural selection to undergraduates. And he'd interacted a lot with Darwin in Edinburgh. But by the time Darwin was living in Gower Street, just opposite close to where Grant was working.
Well, we've got the blue plaque on the wall.
Yeah, we got the blue plaque on the wall, yeah, exactly. It's funny, we don't really know how much they interacted, but Lancaster was the person after Grant.
Oh, okay.
But it's interesting. So one of the things that really surprises people, I think this is we talk about biodiversity loss or biodiversity as one of those things that's quite hard to see or to imagine, because people often think about exotic animals that are in zoos or on television or in exotic parts of the world, but really biodiversity is absolutely everywhere. Mm. George Orwell has a fantastic essay about toads called On the Common Toad, written in 1946. And he wrote it in response to socialists who were saying that interest in nature was kind of trite and bourgeois and sentimental, and we should just be interested in factories and the Bolshevik project and all this stuff. And he argues, no, studying nature is what brings us back into what matters, the idea of beauty, the idea of the soul of man under socialism, which is Oscar Wilde. So he talks about what we think of as mundane, the frogs born in the pond and the way that frogs live, brings us back into this world of communities. Because what we're studying when we study biodiversity, we're studying the evolution of communities and seeing communities everywhere. We talk about ourselves as a society of cells, and that really is a big revelation for students when you say you or yourself as a cooperative society of cells. But you're not just a society of cells, you're also an ecosystem yourself, because there are as many cells within you that aren't human as are human. Within your guts, you've got trillions of cells which are not human, as many as you have cells that are human, that are the same genotype within you. And that is a huge revelation for people, especially when I talk to artists about these things. The idea of the self in itself is a strange concept that we've imposed on all this biodiversity that's within us as well as without us. There's an ecology within a community within us, every one of our cells. And if you're a plant, you also have chloroplasts, photosynthetic cells, which also have different genomic origins. So understanding how those conflicts are overcome to make these cooperative cells that by and large work most of the time pretty well across many conditions is one of the fundamental problems of being an evolutionary biologist.
And what are the implications of climate change for these processes?
Well, that's what we try and understand. One of the things we try and understand. I think there are two things going on, and each of those are crises that would be equally weighty on their own. So climate change is a huge challenge. I mean, the magnitude of climate change seems quite small, 2 degrees, at least 2 degrees, maybe 4 degrees, in the next 30 years or so. One of the things we don't know is how that's going to affect the variability of climates. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we study is the fact that climate is actually, as perceived by organisms, is already very variable. But organisms evolve in order to cope with variation. Like you think about an intertidal zone, you think about anemones living on a rock or a barnacle on a rock. The temperature change between being covered by the ocean, maybe the Atlantic Ocean, or being exposed to a summer day in Dorset, that's a huge difference in temperature, and it's a huge difference in salinity and all these other aspects, a whole different environment of other organisms you're coping with. Birds are attacking you when the tide's out, and when the tide's in, it's like fish attacking you, right? So you've got these two very different systems, but they can cope with that because they know it's very predictable. The tides have a regime that they can evolve to match. The challenge of climate change is that variation will become much less predictable, and organisms will have to evolve to cope with, to make this new environmental regimes predictable. And they might well be beyond the limits of what they can achieve, and so that species will go extinct if they can't evolve to cope with those changes or change their phenotypes within their lifetimes to cope with those changes. And so we'll have species dropping out of communities in a non-random way, and as species and those communities themselves may well become extinct entirely. And so you'll lose information, if you like, 5 billion years of evolution, you'll be losing species from that information, that history. It's the only planet we know in the universe where life has evolved. We've had 5 billion years, a legacy of 5 billion years, which we're destroying in a blink of an eye. So climate change is a challenge, and it's a challenge that many members of the public are very well aware of, and it's something I hear about a lot. But the biodiversity crisis, even without climate change, would be a huge global emergency. And that's mainly the main cause of extinction right now is not climate change. It's the loss of habitat and the destruction of habitat, mainly for things like farming. One of the biggest sources of biodiversity loss is cutting down and removing ancient biomes like rainforests in order to grow meat, and vertebrate products. So that's a huge...
There was a report, I think yesterday, that said that last year there were more rainforest lost in a single year than ever before, which is quite shocking, given that we're all supposed to be aware of, well, you're saying it's not just climate change in that case, it's losing habitats, and we're all supposed to be aware of this, and our politicians are supposed to be aware of it, and yet big business seems to be profiting.
Well,
nevertheless.
So we can talk about that. I mean, there's things that, very biological questions that come into play there. I mean, the first thing I would say is one of the things we do in the centre that I'm the director of in CIBO is we try and understand at what point we reach tipping points in the persistence of really important biomes like rainforests, like coral reefs. We try and understand how communities are assembled by evolution, like ecosystems are assembled by the kind of ecosystems we absolutely depend on for things like rainfall. Rainfall in the prairies of North America and the Ukraine absolutely depends on rainforest around the equator. That, it's millions and millions of tons of water, fresh water, leave the rainforest in clouds and through the Amazon. The Amazon itself has 20% of the world's fresh water. So that raises a really important issue in terms of how is it possible that one person like Bolsonaro can control 20% of the world's fresh water? So the whole idea of nationalism, is utterly absurd when you think about the fact that everyone on the planet depends on resources that are mostly concentrated in those areas of the planet that are still very biodiverse. Europe lost most of its biodiversity in the industrial and agricultural revolutions, but most of the biodiversity on the planet is around the equator and in the shallow tropical seas. The coral reefs, they're being lost mostly because of climate change. There's very interesting reasons why climate is a main driver, apparently, of coral reef loss. Rainforest is a more complicated combination of biodiversity loss and climate. Because we need to remember that biodiversity is what creates climate. The history of the Earth was that, particularly as land plants evolved, came onto land, they released oxygen into the atmosphere, took away carbon dioxide, changed the climate completely, made the world much more wetter, and so created terrestrial water in large abundances in higher latitudes, which other forms of life could use, and they spread out, and diversified in response to that. So the climate is not a passive thing, it's created by organisms. And what we try and understand in CIBO is, both why does biodiversity matter and how does it matter? So why does biodiversity matter for human economies? And that's a really zero-sum game. I mean, it fundamentally matters because without biodiversity, there's nothing. We can't photosynthesize, we can't produce, all the food we eat, it comes from other organisms, either directly or indirectly, right? So, it's a zero-sum game there, but the point is, where do we reach these tipping points where economies have to pay attention to that biodiversity loss? I mean, to paraphrase, Pericles, if you don't take an interest in politics, sooner or later politics takes an interest in you. Well, that's true of biodiversity. And we are rapidly approaching these tipping points, and we don't know how close we are. Maybe some of them have already been exceeded. But I think it's very important that the danger of saying everything's too late, and that's a huge danger in terms of motivating action. The sort of doomsayers saying, oh, it's already too late, and the preppers, The fact is there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and nature is very good at recovering from these kind of perturbations. If you leave rainforest alone, it will grow back, and it will become almost as good as ancient rainforest. One of the problems is once you remove ancient rainforest, you release a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So a lot of the carbon dioxide emissions are due to rainforest loss. So there is this kind of this connection between biodiversity loss and climate change, but they are two very different things. And most extinction now is being driven by human overconsumption. And overconsumption by a very small proportion of the people on this planet. It's only a small proportion of the people who've ever lived. And we look at the wealth distributions, the inequality in terms of wealth, you can see that the people who benefit, as you were alluding to before, from this destruction of nature are largely already very wealthy people or very privileged people who are largely buffered, at least initially, from the consequences of it. The people who are suffering the most are the world's poor, who rely more directly on local biodiversity for food. If they want to get some fish, they walk into the sea and they catch some fish, or into the forests and they catch some mammals, or they collect insects. Those people suffer directly. But of course, as well as that intergenerational poverty, we're committing our children to intergenerational poverty. And it's our own children. And we have to start living on this planet as if we intend to stay here.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, again, an interesting point from Bentham's point of view. He says everyone to count for one and no one for more than one, and that applies, or can be seen to apply to the future. I mean, there's nothing we can do about the past, but this Earth might last another 5 billion years. But, that could be a lot of people over that time, providing it's looked after.
So we're not, this interesting, this idea of stewardship. It's quite, this idea of dominion, it's kind of quite Christian sort of notion. And
looking after the
planet.
Yeah. We've been placed here by God to look after this creation.
And this idea that the world itself isn't divine, but we can achieve divinity through our use on our time on this planet. And also that man is created in God's image, which kind of justified a lot of the colonialism and the destruction of other forms of human civilization and culture by Europeans. So that worldview of in the world is something we must look after and cradle, I think is interesting because it really makes the natural world seem sort of frail and in need of protection. And actually it's the very thing that we depend on, it's the water that we swim in. To quote, well, Otis Redding didn't write the line, but you don't miss your water until the river runs dry. Those tipping points are fundamental to how we think about the world. We think about these tipping points. We see them around us all the time. The tragedy of unintended consequences is writ large in Shakespeare. You talked about good people and bad people. There's no bad people in Shakespeare. I mean, maybe Iago, but there's reasons you might explain why he's so horrible. But most of the people are valiantly and genuinely trying to understand what's going on and trying to do the right thing. I mean, Hamlet does the right thing, but 2 weeks too late. It takes him a long time to realise, are these cues I've been getting, are they accurate or not? How should I react to this terrible slur, this insult? So I think this idea of the way that we behave is driven by the circumstances that we're placed in. And the global economy places us in circumstances where our choices are very narrow, because the entire situation is set up to serve billionaires, to transfer wealth and joy from the poor to the rich. And this is what the socialists from Bloomsbury were arguing 150 years ago, what Bentham to some extent was arguing. And I think the danger there is that we talk about things like, we should know about this, we shouldn't be, doing these consumptions. People always say, I shouldn't be behaving this way because it's bad for the environment. But you're coping with a structure which is essentially bad, essentially created to prevent us seeing the consequences of our actions. So we're operating against a system that has to change.
So is there any particular change that is, I mean, in one sense, it's very pessimistic.
No, well, I'm trying to be optimistic. I am. I mean, we have to, because the uncertainties are enormous.
Yeah.
Everything.
What can we do, as individuals, as collections of cells?
As societies of cells.
Yeah.
I mean, everything I would say is that we are facing a huge part, a bifurcation. Right? There's different futures ahead of us, and one of them is one that we can bend the curve of biodiversity loss, and actually we can act to create more biodiversity. If you protect nature, if you stop, well, it's not so much protecting nature, it's stop having a system that actively funds its destruction through public money. We're facing these two bifurcating paths, and there's a lot of pressure for us to take the wrong path. The way the society is currently organised is to benefit a few at the cost of the many. This idea that it's natural for us to destroy nature, I mean, it's not true. It's because you choose to vote, you choose to have systems in place, international systems which are working across a framework of nationalistic governments who are pretty much powerless to cope with those things. So it's an active choice. We can choose to destroy nature and destroy our own futures. You won't destroy the planet, you won't destroy life. You'll just make life very, very difficult for many people for a long time. And then for everyone, like the rich aren't inoculated completely. They will in their gated communities and in their private healthcare and in their private cars, eventually they will suffer. I mean, there's that quote from the mayor of Bogota who said, a healthy civilization is not one where the poor drive, it's where the rich use public transport. And so I think one of the most positive things we can do is to recognise the value of a community and being part of a community, and move away from this idea of individual families operating independently. I mean, this is quite Benthamite in a way, because of course Bentham's always criticised for being against individual liberty, about the liberty of the society and the two, the best for everyone, but even at the expense of individual freedom. And of course there's a tension always between those two things. But you think about, why did the idea of the nuclear family happen? It was essentially a way of selling more fridges and televisions and cars, so every family had to have those things. But I say, look in your house and say, do I actually need to have, my own car? Can I use the street's car? Can I go to a library of things and borrow a drill? Do I have to buy my own drill, or buy my own lawnmower? So that's one step forward, is think about how you consume. It's okay to consume things that damage the environment sometimes, but do that consciously. If you're going to fly consciously. Think about the fact that you're flying. I mean, if you're going to consume meat, make sure you enjoy it and make sure it's good. So we have options about how we consume. Consuming less meat is probably one of the most important things that anyone can do, anyone who can afford to eat meat. What makes you happy is being part of a community and being loved, and not driving a big car or having a very highly consumptive lifestyle. But it's also about feeling like you have agency. And I think the sort of rhetoric from conservationists can sometimes be, it's all hopeless and it's all your fault, and that makes people feel powerless. So I think one of the things we have to do is we have to sell dreams, not nightmares. I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King didn't say, I have a nightmare, he said, I have a dream. So I would say what one needs to do is to consume more consciously, maybe consume experiences rather than goods. Having a good experience that doesn't involve lots of material production can be expensive and can fuel an economy without necessarily costing the planet huge amounts of resources. Stop thinking about nature as something that's outside you. Think about reimagining the communities that you're part of, which are around, which are everywhere. You don't think you have to go to the Amazon to see biodiversity. There's biodiversity inside you, and there's biodiversity everywhere. And don't think that a biodiverse future is one where you don't get to do anything. It's where everything, many, many, many more things are possible.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Jon, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I didn't talk much about biodiversity.
I think we did.